Hold-up avec prise d'otage cette nuit dans un dépôt d'une société de transport de fonds à Toulouse, la Brinks. 7 ou 8 malfaiteurs ont retenu en otage plusieurs employés avant de s'enfuir ce matin avec 15 millions de francs. Benoît Duquesne.
Camera Silence were an oi punk band that came out of Bordeaux, France in 1981, alongside bands like Comintern Sect and Snicks. They were amongst the originators of a subgenre that is now becoming increasingly more popular. Especially in France and all over Europe, called Cold Oi. Cold Oi is a sound where traditional Oi and UK 82 street punk music like UK Subs, Coxbar, and Sham 69 is blended with the more somber, dark sounds of new wave bands such as The Cure, Joy Division, and Bauhaus. I did a whole video on that music recently. I will link it in the description if you want more information on the bands in that genre. Although Camera Silence initially only appeared on the Chaos in France compilation, or you had to catch them at live shows, their debut LP, Reality, was self-released in 1985. To say this record is a masterpiece would be an understatement. Every song on it is way above average, regardless of genre. As time went on, and the Bordeaux scene started to fracture, the band, including frontman Gilles Bertin, gradually started getting into heroin and living a life of promiscuous sex, drugs, and delinquency.
Le commando, apparemment très bien organisé, avait monté son opération en 2 temps. Premier temps, avec ses fausses 4L de gendarmerie et de faux uniformes, ils se présentent hier soir au domicile du directeur adjoint de la Brinks de Toulouse et le prennent en otage. Deuxième temps, dans les locaux de la Brinks, ils maîtrisent les employés au fur et à mesure de leur arrivée, les menottent et les enferment dans un fourgon. Il n'y a plus ensuite qu'à ouvrir la salle des coffres et disparaître avec 15 millions de francs. Les otages ne seront libérés que vers 8 heures.
The story of Camera Silence isn't a long one, but it's an important one. This band, whether they knew it or not, was incredibly impactful, and their story is much more complicated than just a punk band that put out a single album. So here, in this video, is what I understand to be the story of Camera Silence and their anarchist outlaw frontman, Gilles Bertin. Gilles Bertin was raised in a strict household by his communist father, where education was incredibly important. He was a really good kid at a young age, but around middle school, he started to misbehave and get into trouble. He just wanted to turn 18, drop out of school, and leave home. At 18, he did just that. He left home for the city of Bordeaux, where there was excitement, music, live concerts. It was all happening there. In the early 1980s, Camera Silence was formed, and the band were trying to figure out how to make a little money so that they could record a new album. They had entered in a Battle of the Bands type competition with the hopes of winning a cash prize. They made it to the finals to play against a well-known French band called Noir Désir. Before they even got to the end of the contest, something happened and Noir Désir breaks up, leaving the first prize an easy win for Camera Silence. That prize was 10 days in a recording studio. The universe had given them the opportunity to make a record. Spontaneously and without hardly any preparation, they went into the studio and they wrote their full-length debut record, Reality. While Camera Silence stood up for the poor and represented the lower class, quote-unquote, this album wasn't really a political one. They were more or less nihilists at this point, living a very lawless and reckless lifestyle. In an early interview with the band, they were asked about their name. Camera Silence, what does it mean? Bertin said he had bought a book of letters from the Red Army faction that was about sensory isolation cells. The RAF members were locked up in these cells, and they were called the Camera Silence. Apparently, it is a word or term created by the CIA to refer to these cells prisoners are held captive in while being interrogated and tortured. That is truly terrifying. Camera Silence was, at the heart of things, a true punk rock band with real pedigree, real meaning. They were poor kids without a lot of things, nice clothes, money. They were the disenfranchised of their part of the world, and they wanted equality for everyone and reconciliation for the injustices they and the people they loved had suffered through. With songs like Sans Sursis, meaning without parole, it's clear that these men had lived a rough life and knew what it was like to face the justice system from a vantage point of the poor. It's always been a class war, and Camera Silence was well aware of this fact. They wanted to make a change, and they did their part the best way they could, by spreading a message and making people aware of the social issues they faced through beautiful punk rock music. This group of friends were incredibly passionate about keeping the punk scene alive and forging their own path in France in the early 1980s. They would be told that punk has fallen out of fashion or whatever, but they didn't care. Punk was in its infancy still in the early 80s, and as they said in an interview once, there were many more bands, even just in France, than there were back in 1977. They were still angry, and they felt as though there was plenty to say and music to make, a scene to help keep alive and grow. There was a cause, and they would champion that cause, even if it were up for interpretation and was different for each person. So that's a quick rundown and history of the band. But what about this robbery? That's what we're all interested in, right? I found a documentary on this, but it's in French. And after multiple failed attempts at writing out all of what happened in a way that made sense, I came across an article written by someone named Par Tim from a few years ago on a website called Invisible Bordeaux. I'll link that in the description, but here is how the singer of a French punk rock band became a junkie, went to jail, got clean, met some goons, robbed millions of dollars, and then got away with it. Gilles Bertin was born in Paris in 1961 before spending his formative teenage years in Bordeaux. As soon as he was able to leave behind his home and his civil servant parents, he did just that. He moved into a squat and in 1981 became the vocalist and original bassist of the punk rock band SILENS. The group, who tended to hang out around Place Saint-Projet and the Saint-Pierre Quarter, were soon big on the local scene, winning high-profile Battle of the Bands, and they rapidly developed a nationwide following. The band's relative success, however, was not providing enough income to fund Bertin's heroin addiction, and so he fell into a life of petty crime and robberies, which adhered to the rules of thumb that he and his cronies, mostly artists, drug addicts, and anarchic activists, had set for themselves. That this would generally involve stealing from the man and that nobody would get hurt in the process. By 1986, this darker, illicit existence outweighed Bertin's musical career, and he split from SILENS. Then, in 1988, he and his partners in crime were involved in their most notorious coup, a large-scale operation, reportedly 2 years in the making, involving homemade police uniforms and a fake police car, a finely tuned scenario, and mock interrogations. The heist enabled them to steal more than 11 million francs in banknotes. I think that's around $6 million in today's money. I'm not really sure about that. It was millions of dollars, though, from the Brink's warehouse located in Toulouse. Here's the story of how they planned and executed the heist, told by Bertin himself. In 1983, he goes to jail and subsequently quits heroin. While in jail and finding himself newly sober, he began to form a group of friends. Some were junkies, but others were just punk rockers, anarchists, and all-around criminals. 2 people he used to get high with on the outside were in there with him, and they all 3 committed to staying clean this time. They formed a close bond with one another. That was not the kind of life they wanted for themselves anymore. The only issue is that when they get out of jail, they will have all this time to do whatever they want, probably get in trouble. With all this newfound free time, the trio replaced one addiction with another, adrenaline. Soon they fall into petty criminality. They do some small robberies, then an armed robbery. Then the next thing they do, it plays out like a heist, like Ocean's 11 or The Italian Job. Between the 3 of them, somebody was good at just about everything. Disguises, theft, gadgets, driving, verbal manipulation, etc. Music was no longer doing enough for these guys anymore. There wasn't enough excitement and play into an audience. They needed that fix, that spike in heart rate. Something I'm very familiar with, unfortunately. They needed to fear something. This is rebellion in its purest form, an aberration of a global system. It's about freedom. Freedom to do what you want and to be who you want to be. To demand recognition that they were human beings and not just objects made to serve a world with no other meaning than to pleasure those in power. So they hatched a plan to rob a Brink's warehouse. In the beginning, it was kind of a joke, but then they started laying the groundwork and thinking that maybe they could really do this. They planned for a solid year to pull this heist off. They had already been through addiction, jail, violence. They weren't scared of doing it. They felt unstoppable. The group of guys would get up at about 4 in the morning. They would pretend to go jogging so they could case the building. The whole time, they would be taking notes on what's going on inside the building. They were doing this job with no inside man, so they were trying to be careful and take their time. They even went through the trash at the place just to get information on what was going on, who was there, when, what, where, all that stuff, right? They worked incredibly hard to find patterns of who did what, when, who had keys to the building and what rooms. The work was slow and tedious, but they were determined to make it through the other side with millions and millions of dollars. All this information created little puzzle pieces that were then put together to start forming the idea of how they were going to rob this Brink's warehouse. They started working on the logistics of the quickly forming plan, uniforms, cars, etc. They were a bit worried about impersonating police, but the potential score was just too enticing. They used military surplus to create the police uniforms. They took over the main room of the building, and when an employee was supposed to be there who arrived late, they would just take the person, intercept them, put them in a van while the robbery was happening, and that way they avoided somebody calling the cops or interfering with them while they were actually doing the robbery. They took the military surplus uniforms that they bought and they painted them blue, and then they took a piece of black, I think electrical tape, and ran it down the side of the leg. So from a distance, it would be pretty convincing that that was a police officer. Once you get a little closer, it was obvious that it wasn't a cop, but by that time it's a little too late. The plan was so simple that it was causing them anxiety. It was almost too easy to do. As the employees began to arrive for work, they were already waiting for them. So they would just gather them in the same place before they had the chance to get away. Instead of having to show up and interrupt a workday and not being sure if they had everyone accounted for, they just did everything before the place opened. The staff at Brink's were basically taken hostage before they even knew what was going on. They had all the employees held in the locker room while they waited on the van to show up that had the keys to the Brink's vault. Bertin talks about how they didn't want to be violent towards people that they were robbing, but they felt they weren't doing anything too serious because they weren't actually going to harm anyone. They weren't going to use the weapons for real. But, they thought it was just a game. Later in his life, he admitted that it was already violence just by pointing a weapon at somebody, that is violence. He said, just because you don't kidnap somebody from their home, it doesn't mean that you're not committing an act of violence against them. He had been reflecting on the things that he had done, maybe the things he regretted doing as a young man. After they got the keys to the vault, they emptied it into their van and took off. Just like that. It was so simple. Too simple. The feelings they had after the robbery were incredibly conflicting. It felt like another person. Like watching the events unfold from his physical body, like above him. Like I've kind of felt like that in the past, right? Was it all a dream? Did he win the lottery? Is this really happening? Feelings of jubilation immediately followed by bouts of paranoia and fear of being caught and going back to prison. He didn't want to go back to jail. Ever. Begs to question why he'd be doing this, right? After the robbery, the gang split up. They took their loot. They decided to go their separate ways so as to hopefully, decrease the chances of being caught. And they didn't tell each other where they were going. They just kind of went their own ways. I think they ultimately all ended up in Spain. That was that. They came. They conquered. They vanished. Over the following 2 years, the various members of the gang were caught one after another. But Gilles had managed to escape to Spain's Costa Brava, leaving behind not only his homeland, but also his partner and his newly born son, Loris. While on the run, due to an international arrest warrant being issued, as well as spending all of his money, he met Cecilia, with whom he moved to Lisbon, where they opened a tiny but very influential independent record store, which operated for about 10 years. Needless to say, officially, Gilles Bertin didn't exist anymore, and he would start going by aliases over the next few years. The plot thickened, though, when in 1995 he fell ill. It emerged that his years of heroin addiction had finally caught up to him. He was HIV positive and he had contracted the AIDS virus. Despite being at death's door, he was saved first by a hospital in a communist-run town where no questions were asked about his identity. Pretty fortunate there, I would say. Then by the advances of research and the administration of triple combination therapy. I don't know a whole lot about that, but it seems like he got dealt a pretty lucky hand. In the early 2000s, Bertin and his partner relocated to Barcelona, running the bar owned by Cecilia's parents. The couple had a child together, Tiago, whose birth in 2011 led Bertin to deciding the time had come to open up about his past and move forward with a clean conscience. In November 2016, he chose to return to France and hand himself in to the authorities to, well, I guess you could say, face the music. As detailed in the documentary I spoke about earlier, By then, Bertin was no longer really considered a public enemy, and if anything, his reappearance was not especially welcome as it reopened a cold case and therefore multiple layers of admin responsibilities and paperwork. Nobody wants to do that, right? That was no longer considered relevant by any of the parties involved. He was nevertheless put on trial, and 30 years from the heist was sentenced to a 5-year suspended sentence, therefore escaping a stay in jail altogether. By becoming a free man and being able to live life in the open once again, he was able to reconnect with his first son, Loris, whose mother had passed away, and then he took the time out to collaborate with a journalist on drafting his memoirs. He divided his time between Toulouse and Barcelona, where he continued working in that bar alongside Cecilia and raising Tiago. His life was becoming normal again, something I doubt he ever thought was going to happen. But given that the authorities had declared him deceased in 1992, another of his priorities was to obtain his French identity documents. This became a long, drawn-out battle, which eventually lasted him 3 entire years. He was finally given his new ID card on August 2nd of 2019, but just days later, his health ailing once again, he fell into a coma. Gilles Bertin died on November 7th, 2019 in Barcelona at age 58. So there you have it. That's the history and story behind one of the best bands, best albums in a rather new subgenre of cold oi music, one of French punk's most notorious musicians and stories. This is one that I found incredibly interesting. I hope I did it justice. It took me a long time to figure out how I wanted to attack this, and I wanted to come at it with as much fact as I could possibly find. And so that's why I chose to take a big chunk out of that article. So I'll put credit to it in the description. Please, if you like what I'm doing here, let me know in the comments. Give me a thumbs up. Subscribe to the channel. Let's grow this community. I'm doing the best work I can. I think I'm doing a pretty good job. I'd love to hear what you think. So, but yeah, this story is pretty amazing. The band was amazing. That album is fantastic, and it really did. I don't know. There's like a legend there. It's created this wild legend. It's almost like a Robin Hood-esque story with a real somber kind of a downer of an ending. But that's kind of par for the course in a life like this. It kind of surprises me that he was out for so many years without getting caught. I mean, working at a small record store and then running a bar for a little while, just to then live at your twilight years with your family. I kind of feel like if he had been given the choice of go off into obscurity and just kind of do his own thing and leave the world behind, or do it this way, I feel like he probably would have chose this way. I know I would if I had been given the two choices. So yeah, I hope I pronounced his name right. I was trying. Like I said, I don't speak French, so. But yeah, Camera Silence, amazing band. Realite is an amazing album. I urge you to go listen to it. And if you have any recommendations for other videos I can do, other topics I could cover, stories that you want to hear about, please let me know in the comments. All right, thank you so much for hanging out here at the Punk Rock Review. Catch you next time. Peace.